The great Old Testament theologian Walter Brueggemann has written a small book on the Sabbath, Sabbath as Resistance, saying no to the culture of now. And in this he says the following in his introduction, page 4. In our contemporary context of the rat race of anxiety, the celebration of Sabbath is an act of both resistance and alternative. It is resistance because it is a visible insistence that our lives are not defined by the production and consumption of commodity goods. He continues, Sabbath is not only resistance, it is alternative. It is an alternative to the demanding, chattering, pervasive presence of advertising and its great liturgical claim of professional sports that devour all our rest time. The alternative on offer is the awareness and practice of the claim that we are situated on the receiving end of the gifts of God. With these words, I want to invite you to listen to the final tidbit from the book of Nehemiah. We have reached chapter 13, and Sabbath issues are exactly one of the challenges that Nehemiah faces in this chapter. Now, as you have read or listened with me to the book of Nehemiah, you probably realize that the book, like the book of Ezra, is hardly written chronologically. And here in the final chapters of the book, several major themes are emphasized, irrespective of the chronological sequence of events. We realize, for one, that Nehemiah has been back at the Persian court and now has been returning to Judah. When he returns in chapter 13, he realizes that the temple service has gone down, so he has to restore it. One of the major themes we looked at the latter part of chapter 12 is thanks and joy, expressed in particular with an emphasis on the singing in the temple. Now two other themes appear. The first is the Sabbath. As Nehemiah, after his return, takes a look at the conditions, he realizes what he says in verse 15 of chapter 13. In those days, I saw in Judah people treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in heaps of grain, and loading them on donkeys, and also wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And he reacts. Now, of course, in the book of Nehemiah, the emphasis is very much on the practical aspect. Yet, in the context within the book, you look back to the great prayer in chapter 9 and realize that already there is an emphasis on the Sabbath. In chapter 9, which is a covenant prayer, part of the covenant established between God and his people. In chapter 9, in verse 6, you have actually a quote from the Sabbath. You are the Lord, you alone. You have made heaven, the heaven of heavens, with all the host, the earth and all that is on it, the seas and all that is in them. And even a little later in that wonderful prayer in verses 13 and 14, there is an emphasis on the Sabbath. So also within the context of Nehemiah, this second to last major theme of the book, the Sabbath, is congruent with what we have seen. Now, it looks good that there is life, there is trading. Isn't that good for society? Let's turn once again to Walter Brueggemann, who has this to say. Coveting and the other end of the Decalogue consist in the pursuit of commodity at the expense of the neighbour. This is from page 86 and 87 of his little book. Sabbath, he says, is a big no for both. It is a no to the worship of commodity. It is a no to the pursuit of commodity. But it is more than no. Sabbath is a regular, disciplined, visible, concrete yes to the neighborly reality of the community beloved by God. We used to sing the hymn, "Take Time to Be Holy." But perhaps we should be singing, "Take Time to Be Human." Or finally, take time. Sabbath is taking time. Time to be holy. Time to be human. End of quote. To Nehemiah, Sabbath was such a time of rest. And note that the emphasis throughout the book has also been on giving to the poor. So this no to the pursuit of commodity has a strong theological basis in the book. And then he adds in this context another perspective. He tells them, verse 18, "Did not your fathers act in this way, and did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Now you're bringing more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath." In other words, he refers to the history of the people with God. The Sabbath is to Nehemiah, as it was to these Israelites, these believers, a major mark of their identity. And that is strengthened by the reference to the fact of history that the lack of Sabbath keeping was one of the major reasons that the people had been brought into the exile in Babylon in the first place. And then let's turn to the next major theme in this last chapter of the book. That has to do with marriage and family. In those days, Nehemiah tells us in verse 23, "I also saw the Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab." These are neighboring countries. "And half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but only the language of each people. I confronted them, I cursed them, and beat some of them, and pulled out their hair." That tells a little more maybe about the personality of Nehemiah, and I don't want to comment upon that as such. But I do want to comment on this seemingly harsh treatment, because the end result is that he asks them and gets them to send their families away. We shouldn't do that, should we? Now we have to remember the historical context. It's not all marriages throughout the ages that have been between one man and one woman choosing to love each other voluntarily. Most marriages, as they were here, were family or tribal contracts. Families reunioned or united with other families. And as you see, these Israelites who had married with other families who were not Israelites, their children grew up as pagans. They would take part in pagan rituals. So the issue here is not love, but identity, once again. And as you see, there is also in the context a reference to the history, because this intermingling with the pagans had been one of the major reasons for the exile, like the breaking of the Sabbath. So these two major practical elements of the covenant, Sabbath keeping and marriage, are both signs of identity. They're both argued with a reference back to history, and we are allowed to think theologically and note that these two institutions are exactly those two institutions which God established in the Garden of Eden at creation. They go back to creation. I notice that in the prayer there was a specific emphasis on God as the creator. One last note. As you read, you will find throughout Nehemiah, as especially in this chapter, some statements which belong to what you could call an ongoing prayer by Nehemiah to God. He reminds God. In verse 14, after having restored the temple service, "Remember me, O God, concerning this. Do not write out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for his service." And after having re-established Sabbath keeping, in verse 22 he says, "Remember this also in my favor, O my God, and spare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love." Telling how he rejected the enemy's claims, in 29 he says, "Remember them, O my God." And then he closes his book, his memoir, with this one sentence, "Remember me, O my God, for good." Some would feel that the good Nehemiah is a little legalistic. But let's speak about the prayers in their context also. The truth is that Old Testament prayer very often are spoken in the context or against the background of the judicial forensic language of the time. When you come to God in prayer, you step into his courtroom, and saved by his mercy, and that is also certainly an emphasis in Nehemiah. Nehemiah also wants to remind God, God, look at this I did for you. We're still saved by mercy. But Nehemiah, naturally as a human being, also wants God to remember that he had tried to keep his people within the covenant they had established with God. Thank you for listening to this last tidbit from the book of Nehemiah. You're always welcome to listen in on some of the other tidbits. I'm Dr. Paul Petersen, and we'll be happy to see you back. Thank you.